All right, let's start this session now. We're going to have David Yates from Universidade de Lisboa. It's a great pleasure, actually, to receive you here, Tiradentes. Very happy to accept to come here. And actually, the organizers here, we are very happy with all the guests. I mean, you are really awesome. It's really, you're making this a great meeting. So I want to thank you again, and let's go. Oh, you're going to use that one?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Is it okay like this? So thank you very much to Rodrigo and Mark for the organization. It's a real pleasure to be here. So let me say something about, sorry, I have a cough sweep in my mouth. It's almost run out. The talk will become clear in about 5 minutes. So let me tell you a bit about the background to me becoming interested in this particular aspect of Dave's work. I've been working on a project trying to understand what it means for space-time to be emergent in theories of quantum gravity, which are way too complex for me to understand. But we can make some headway on the general problem of what space-time emergence would amount to, whatever the fundamental ontology turns out to be, and that's kind of what I've been doing. So I mean, the idea is that these fundamental ontologies like string theory and loop quantum gravity, they don't look intuitively spatiotemporal. If that's the kind of world we inhabit, then it seems like our experience as of living in a spatiotemporal world must be somehow mistaken, because that's not the real nature of the world we live in, okay? The fundamental ontology doesn't look anything like that. So it seems like space-time must be some kind of illusion. And then you very quickly run into this problem that's become known as the problem of empirical incoherence, which is that our confirmation of these fundamental space-time theories depends on observations that we make within space-time. So if they turn out to be radically non-spatiotemporal ontologies, how is it that we ever managed to confirm them? How can we, and you can express that in terms of the question of how it is we can deduce spatiotemporal predictions from a non-spatiotemporal fundamental theory. And that, of course, is where Dave's work comes in. Now, he sees spatiotemporal concepts as, I don't know which of the different terminologies to use. Maybe semantically non-neutral would have been better than transparent, but I'm going to stick with transparent for today. Non-transparency. So spatiotemporal concepts are non-transparent. They don't reveal the essences of their reference. They pick them out as the occupants of roles. And then the core idea is going to be that, well, if we're living in a string theory world, we can pick out a string theoretic property as the occupant of the role. And if we're living in the matrix, we pick out a computational property as the occupant of the relevant role. So Dave's work, I should put it like this. The idea that spatiotemporal concepts pick out the occupants of roles enables us to scrute the spatiotemporal from the non-spatiotemporal. And that's exactly the kind of thing you need to do if the fundamental theory is a non-spatiotemporal fundamental theory. You need to be able to deduce predictions about the way things behave in space-time from a non-spatiotemporal theory, and the scrutability of spatiotemporal claims would make that possible. So Dave's work in constructing the world in particular has a very broad application, and it can be very fruitfully employed to give us a way of thinking about space-time emergence, and in particular to give us a handle on this problem of empirical incoherence that arises. But I'm not going to talk any more about that today. I'm going to talk instead about a very similar application of the view to matrix-style skepticism. And it's going to be much simpler, not only for you, but for me to get my head around than if I tried to talk about string theory and loop quantum gravity. Okay, I have to do this myself. Okay, so here's the structure of the talk. First of all, I'm going to say a bit about how non-transparent concepts enable us to give anti-skeptical interpretations of matrix-style scenarios. And then I'm going to talk about Dave's particular brand of non-transparency about space-time concepts, his spatial functionalism. And then I'm going to argue that this is very much a talk where I agree with the spirit of what Dave is doing, but not with the letter of it. So I'm going to argue against his particular brand of spatial functionalism. And then I'm going to suggest that there are other versions of spatial functionalism that we can develop that have the same kind of consequences for matrix skepticism and by implication for the problem of empirical coherence that I was talking about for quantum theories of gravity. But I'm going to go a little bit further than that. I'm then going to suggest that, in fact, we can get all that we want in terms of anti-skeptical responses to the matrix without losing the transparency of spatiotemporal concepts. We can keep hold of that intuitive idea that spatial experience and spatial concepts reveal to us the essential nature of space-time without then having to say that we're massively mistaken if it turns out that the matrix is actual. Okay. So as I've already hinted at, according to Chalmers, the matrix is not a skeptical hypothesis, but a metaphysical one. Oh, I haven't done that. Okay, I've forgotten already. Slide 2, and I've already forgotten. You want to do it for me? Yeah. Much better that way. I thought I could handle doing 2 things at once, but apparently I also have that issue. So the matrix is not a skeptical hypothesis, it's a metaphysical one. To make good on that sort of claim, you have to explain how our ordinary beliefs come out true, even if we're in the matrix. And you can see how that might work with objects. Suppose a claim like the apple is red or something like that. It's not a massive stretch to suppose that things like apples could be composed of digital states or programs or something like that. They're already composed of really weird stuff. We're in the matrix, they're just composed of a different kind of really weird stuff. And then properties like their color, you can treat dispositionally. Color is red, redness is whatever. Property normally gives rise to reddish phenomenology. So the apple is red will come out true in the matrix because there is something there which I'm referring to with the term apple, which is composed of computer programs and which has the property that normally gives rise to reddish phenomenology. So it'll come out true that the apple is red, even if we're living in a virtual world. So then the question is, what do we do about spatiotemporal claims? A lot of our claims about ordinary objects involve the attribution of spatiotemporal properties, like the apple is on the table, or the apple is in my pocket, or something like that. So what do those concepts refer to if it turns out that the matrix is actual? So, as I said, intuitively it seems like spatiotemporal concepts are transparent to their reference. I'm using transparent in this talk in the sense of essence revealing, at least partially essence revealing, such that when you token the concept, you have a handle on the nature of its referent, on the real nature of its referent. If that were true about spatiotemporal concepts, like being a meter long, being spherical, being three-sided, then it seems like we have to say that all our spatiotemporal beliefs come out false in the matrix because there's nothing like that. There's nothing in the matrix that is as space-time is revealed to us in experience, okay? So if you have a kind of primitivism about space-time, it looks like you're driven to the view that we're massively mistaken if we're in the matrix. And that's when non-transparency comes in. You think of spatial concepts are kind of topic neutral, non-transparent, whichever your preferred terminology is, in the same way that color concepts are. So the concept red picks out whatever property normally causes reddish phenomenology, and it picks it out in a non-transparent way. Just by tokening the concept, you have no idea what kind of property that is. Its nature is not revealed to you in experience, although the nature of your phenomenal state plausibly is. And the idea then is you say the same about spatial concepts as you do about things like color concepts. So Dave's particular brand of spatial functionalism is phenomenal functionalism, where it turns out that spatial concepts, I'm going to talk about spatial concepts bracketing temporal concepts, and just hope that that sort of all comes out in the wash. So spatial concepts turn out to be very much like color concepts. They pick out the normal causes of space-timey phenomenology. The concept spherical picks out the normal cause of spherish experiences. The concept being a meter apart picks out whatever property normally causes experiences with a certain distinctive meter apart-ish phenomenology. And they pick these things out non-transparently. So spatial concepts pick out, as Dave says, string theoretic properties at a string world, loop quantum gravity properties of the loop quantum gravity world, digital properties at a matrix world. So matrix dwellers are right to attribute sphericality to footballs. What you have is a ball that's composed of digital states and program states. And that thing, that composite object, really does have the property that normally causes spherish experiences. So it's literally true, even if we're in the matrix, that footballs are round. Footballs are spherical. And that's a very nice thing to be able to say. And he extends this view to spatial experiences by means of a kind of Fregean representationalism. So spatial concepts pick out whatever properties normally cause. Excuse me. Spatial concepts pick out whatever properties normally cause a certain kind of phenomenology. And the phenomenal character of conscious spatial experiences, like as of being here in this theater or as of seeing a sphere, those phenomenal characters are understood as representations of the properties that normally give rise to that very type of phenomenology. So there's a unified account of spatial concepts and spatial experiences. And they both, topic neutrally, or semantically non-neutrally, or non-transparently, pick out the properties that normally give rise to a certain kind of phenomenology. Okay. So this is the claim that I really want to take issue with in this talk. In 3 puzzles about spatial experience, Dave says, I conclude somewhat paradoxically, precisely because we're directly presented with fewer features of the world than we might have thought, we're less open to illusion and deception. And that's a really nice way of putting it. It's the non-transparency of our spatial concepts and experiences that make it possible for them to pick out string theoretic properties or digital properties if we're in a simulation. And it's the fact that they can refer in this way that enables us to say that most of our ordinary claims come out true, even if we're in the matrix. And that, in turn, is what enables us to give an anti-skeptical interpretation of matrix-style scenarios. So for Dave, non-transparency is crucial to the anti-skeptical interpretation. But I want to suggest that it's not. We can hang on to at least some of our intuitive idea that space is presented to us as it really is in experience and thought. So it's going to be harder for me to make that stick than the other bits, I suspect. But let me see what I can do. So let me look at Dave offers several twin Earth style arguments for non-transparency. I'm going to mention one of them, and I'll come back to it at various points. Because one of the things I want to say is that transparent accounts of spatial concepts can also account for the intuitions that we have present in these twin cases. So I'm going to give you a brief run-through of the twin case, just so I can refer back to it later. So imagine Lorentz Earth, which moves at very high velocity, 0.87 the speed of light relative to Earth in a particular direction. By Lorentz contraction, Lorentz Earth will be 50% smaller in the direction of motion than Earth is. Don't really worry about the details of that. So it's a phenomenon in special relativity where the shape of things depend on which frame of reference you measure them from. Things moving at a very high velocity relative to you will appear contracted to you. Well, will be contracted relative to you. Let's put it that way. So Chalmers says, look, if it turns out that we were on Lorentz Earth, suppose we're moving at 0.87 c relative to some absolute reference frame, then objectively speaking, Earth is not spherical. I mean, it's not spherical anyway, but just suppose it is. If it turned out that Lorentz Earth were actual, then Earth would be compressed 50% in the direction of motion. What should we then say? Have we always been wrong to suppose that the Earth was roughly spherical? Is this kind of widespread error possible in these situations? And Dave says, no, it's not. And what that shows us is that the concept spherical is non-transparent. It's picking out whatever normally gives rise to spherish phenomenology. And on Lorentz Earth, which is contracted, the property that normally gives rise to spherish phenomenology, at least from our perspective, is not sphericality. It's being an oblong which is half as wide along one axis as it is along the other. So, for Lorentz Earth, Dave, it's true to say that Lorentz Earth is roughly spherical because it has the property that normally gives rise to spherish experiences for them. But for us on Earth, it's not correct to say that Lorentz Earth is spherical because it doesn't have the property that normally causes spherish experiences in us. So, here's how I see the argument working. There's no systematic error in twin cases such as these, so the proposition that Earth is spherical is true both on Lorentz Earth and on Earth, actual Earth. But Lorentz Earth is not in the extension of Earth Dave's concept spherical and vice versa. So spherical must be non-transparent. It picks out some property as the occupant of a role rather than as the property that it essentially is, rather than transparently. So spatiotemporal concepts are not going to be essence revealing on this view. And Dave goes further and says that the role in question should be understood in terms of bringing about phenomenology, bringing about certain kind of spatial experience. So I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to say, look, suppose I accept 1 to 3 here. Phenomenology is not the right way of understanding the role in question. So even if I accept all of 1 to 3, the idea that spatial concepts pick out their reference by means of spatiotemporal experience is not quite right. So I'll give you an argument for that claim. And then I want to say that you can accept 1 and 2 here without accepting 3. So there's a way for spatial concepts to be transparent and still respect our intuitions in these twin Earth cases. So let me, okay, I've already said that. I'll argue for 2 things. Firstly, we need a non-phenomenological approach to spatiotemporal concepts, and that we can make sense of the matrix as metaphysics, give an anti-skeptical interpretation, without giving up on transparency. Okay, so I have 2 very simple arguments against phenomenal functionalism. They're perhaps a little bit too simple, especially the second one. Let me see if I can persuade you. So, if you're familiar with the philosophy of mind, you'll know that logical behaviorism failed because there's no non-circular way of saying which behavioral dispositions correspond to which mental states. They can't be paired up one-to-one. If I believe it's raining outside, then I'm disposed to take an umbrella, but only if I want to stay dry, and that's another mental state. How do I analyze I want to stay dry? Well, if I believe it's raining, then I'll take an umbrella. But now we're back to the belief we started with, so you have a very tight definitional circle there. And you need to go holistic to avoid that kind of circularity. That was the lesson of logical behaviorism for the philosophy of mind. There's a similar circularity problem here. There is no way that spheres look independently of their other spatial properties. A rolling sphere presents a different phenomenology to a stationary sphere in relation to you. The direction of the illumination makes a difference to how spheres look. A sphere in a box won't look like anything. I mean, the phenomenology that a sphere presents, that it causes on some occasion, is going to depend on the totality of its spatial properties. At the very least, there's no way to, there seems to be there's no privileged way of saying, look, I mean, you might say, look, the ideal location for a sphere to be, for me to determine what spherish phenomenology is right in front of me. But how far away should it be? Why should it be right in front of me? These are other spatial properties. What we're talking about there is the way a complex spatial situation looks, not the way a sphere looks. But then why suppose that that situation is privileged in respect of the phenomenology that defines the concept spherical? So there's a circularity problem here, which you can fix by going holistic and supposing that a concept like sphericality is the concept of, is a very complex concept now. Is a concept of a certain kind of phenomenology if it's there, a different kind of phenomenology if it's moving, another kind if it's in a box, another kind if it's above me, another kind if it's transparent, like a bubble. So if you go holistic, you end up with a very complex set of concepts. When we're thinking about something as spherical, we're actually thinking about a huge number of different ways it might appear if combined with other spatial properties. I don't have a knockdown argument against that view. It just doesn't seem like the right thing to say to me. It attributes a lot of conceptual complexity in relation to phenomenology to the folk. So to think a spatial thought is to think a very complex thought about how a whole range of spatial properties combine to give rise to certain kinds of experiences. And that just doesn't seem right to me. I can't really say much more than that. It just looks like too much phenomenological complexity. Relatedly, and even more simple-mindedly, I think this kind of account focuses way too much on visual phenomenology. As natural, when you think about spherish phenomenology, you think about something that visually looks the same in all directions and it presents a kind of smoothness and a roundness or something like that. But this kind of makes it impossible for a congenitally blind person to think the same thoughts as a sighted person, the same spatial thoughts. So think of it in terms of two-dimensional semantics, if you like. A congenitally blind person will be thinking about tactile phenomenology, presumably, and they'll be securing reference to the same property as a sighted person who will be thinking in terms of visual phenomenology, primarily. But if the cognitive contents of our thoughts are given by the primary intentions of the concepts, as indeed seems plausible, then they're really thinking different thoughts. Cognitively speaking, congenitally blind people and sighted people don't have the same spatial concepts. Those concepts pick out the same properties, but they're not the same concepts, and we're not thinking the same thoughts. I note that this only applies to the conceptual story. Nobody thinks that congenitally blind people and sighted people have the same conscious experiences of space. But in terms of concepts, it seems overwhelmingly plausible to me to suppose that a congenitally blind person could think the same spatial thoughts. When they think the sphere rolled down the inclined plane, they're thinking the same thought as a sighted person. But they don't have any visual phenomenal concepts by which to pin it down, so they must be thinking a different thought. And again, I don't have a knockdown argument. It just doesn't seem like the right thing to say to me. I'm going to skip that. What does seem like the right thing to say is something that Dave hints at various points, which is a form of theoretical functionalism. So rather than picking out spatial properties as the occupant of the role of causing spatial phenomenology, we pick them out as the occupants of theoretical roles. And I think this is a much more promising line to take. There's one that Dave mentions at a couple of points in Constructing the World, but doesn't really develop that much. So here are some theoretical posits I've sketched involving spatial concepts and temporal concepts. Part of our folk theory of space and time, A and B are the same distance apart as C and D if it takes the same time to travel between them at constant velocity. Spatiotemporal contiguity is necessary for causal interaction. Dave actually says something like this in Constructing the World. Spatial separation is what there's no causal interaction at, I think is how it goes. Every point on a sphere's surface is equidistant from its center. And you can think of writing down all of these posits in the manner of a Lewisian philosophy of mind, treating them as specifying theoretical roles, and then ramsifying in relation to those roles. So I take it that's all kind of clear how that's going to work. Spatial separation is the property P such that causal interaction requires 0P. Note that I haven't ramsified causal interaction. Okay, you've got to leave stuff like that unramsified in this sort of view. Otherwise you end up with nothing but cardinality. You get the Newman problem. So suppose we leave causal interaction unramsified and suppose that that's the same in the matrix as it is in a non-matrix world. Perhaps a little controversial. You can see how it would go. Theoretical roles are going to enable us to pick out properties by means of the roles they occupy. Now, some nice consequences of this. A congenitally blind scientist can think the same thoughts as a sighted scientist. So when a blind scientist is predicting that the ball rolls down the inclined plane, they're thinking a thought with the same cognitive content as a sighted person. And that seems like the right thing to say. Matrix dwellers still refer to digital properties and relations. They refer to the ones that occupy the theoretical roles, rather than the ones that bring about their phenomenology. So we've kind of got rid of phenomenology from the role specification. And we don't need to appeal to phenomenology to get the Lorentz Earth case right. The reason is that, remember, Lorentz Earth is crushed because it's moving really, in relation to us, from our point of view, we see Lorentz Earth as squashed. On Lorentz Earth, they see it as spherical. Who's right? Well, we're both right, because it occupies the sphere role for them, but not for us. To occupy the sphere role is going to be, well, some of the posits I wrote, the sphere, every point on a sphere's surface is equidistant from its center. Well, when they measure the shape of their Earth, they're going to measure it to be spherical because their measuring rods are also compressed in the direction of motion, from our point of view. If we measure Lorentz Earth with measuring rods that are stationary in our frame of reference, it won't come out spherical. It doesn't occupy the sphere role for us, but it does for them. So you get all the same consequences without the supposition, without constitutively tying spatiotemporal concepts to phenomenology. So I think theoretical functionalism is a much better option. Now, this is a familiar distinction to those working in the philosophy of mind. How am I doing? I don't know exactly when I started. Let's say I have 20 minutes left. That's fine. So thus far, I've looked at phenomenal and theoretical reference-fixing stories about spatial concepts. On Dave's view, spatial concepts pick out the properties that normally give rise to certain phenomenology in us. As I've said, I don't think that's the right story, but it's not the end of the world for this view, certainly, because, as Dave hints at, there's a theoretical version of the story on which spatial concepts pick out the occupants of theoretical roles. Both of these are forms of realizer or conceptual functionalism. Functional stories about our concepts, but what the concepts pick out is first-order role occupiers, the things that occupy the roles, and they pick them out non-transparently. And what I want to suggest is if you go second-order functional, you can suppose that spatial concepts are transparent, and you can still say all the nice stuff about the matrix. So this is a typical distinction. Reference fixing, X is spherical if and only if X has the property that occupies the sphere role, whichever property that might be, so it's non-transparent. But on a second-order functionalist story, actually second-order is the wrong way of describing this for reasons I might go into later. But let me stick with that for now. Functional individuation. X is spherical. X has the property of having some property that occupies the sphere role. So for those not familiar with this distinction, it can look like a distinction that makes no difference whatsoever. Think of it this way. On the first story, spatial concepts pick out whatever occupies a certain theoretical role. Okay? So they're going to pick out different things in the matrix and in our world, assuming our world is not the matrix. In our world, presumably spatial, maybe they pick out string theoretic properties, maybe they pick out loop quantum gravitational properties, who knows? But in the matrix, they pick out digital properties of computer programs, things like that. If this kind of story is true, functional individuation, then they don't pick out the specific occupants of the roles. What they do is pick out sort of the structure itself, the fact that the roles are occupied by something. So if this story is true, they might well pick out the same things in the matrix and the actual world because the roles are occupied by they're occupied by something different. But on a functional individuation story, we're not picking out the role occupants anymore, we're picking out the fact that they're occupied by something, the structure itself, rather than the nodes of the structure. And this is an old philosophy of mind distinction. On Lewis's conceptual functionalism, Payne picks out the occupant of the pane role, whatever it might be. So if I have a different occupant of my pane role to an octopus, then pane picks out a different property in me to the one it picks out in the octopus. There are lots of complexities with Lewis's theory that I won't go into. It's actually much more subtle and interesting than that. But on a second order story, as long as the octopus has some state that occupies the pane role, and I have some state that occupies the pane role, our concept pane picks out exactly the same property in octopus and in people, so it allows for multiple realization. So on this view, we should say the matrix and the actual world have a common structure, and it's this structure that we refer to with our spatial concepts, spatial temporal concepts. I suppose we say the same about spatial experiences. I don't know how to adjudicate these debates, by the way. I'm not going to give you an argument that second-order functionalism is true. It's just going to be suppositional. I can try and argue for it a bit in Q&A if you want. At the moment, just suppose it. So, if you say the same about spatiotemporal experiences, then rather than picking out a specific fundamental property, our spatial experiences are representations of structure. And that actually seems like quite a plausible thing to say to me. So you could tell the same kind of, so Dave has a unified story, a realizer functionalist story, whereby spatial concepts pick out the occupants of roles, depending, and they pick out different things at different worlds. Spatiotemporal experiences represent the occupants of those roles as the causes of phenomenology. But on the kind of view I'm proposing, spatiotemporal concepts are structural, and they pick out structural properties. They pick out properties that are individuated by their places in a structure. And I think it's quite plausible to say that our experiences represent spatial properties like that, as structural. They represent things as being, they don't represent absolute lengths, for example. Our spatiotemporal experiences don't represent the property of being a meter long. They represent the property of being the same length, of this being the same length as that, of all the points at a sphere's surface being the same length from its center. And that's the kind of experience we have when we experience things spatially. But that, to me, is to say that spatial experiences represent structurally. Okay, this last point is a little bit more, you might wonder what should we say about Lorentz Earth. In this case, it was quite easy in the realizer functionalist case. We could just say that Lorentz Earth, the one that's squashed from our point of view, occupies the sphere role for its occupants, but not for people in our frame of reference, because we measure it differently. Our measuring rods interact with it in different ways. In this case, we have to say something about realization. If we're both right to describe our respective Earths as spherical, then I think we have to treat shape as extrinsic, as realized by relations between objects. So shape is spherical shape of Lorentz Earth is realized by relations between Lorentz Earth and measuring rods that are stationary within its frame of reference. There's a structural property realized by relations between objects and Lorentz Earth. Now, if we look at the relations between measuring rods that are stationary on Earth and Lorentz Earth itself, well, those relations don't realize sphericality. But there's no contradiction there. Because if shape is extrinsic, there's no problem with saying Lorentz Earth is spherical in relation to measuring rods there, and non-spherical when you think of measuring rods stationary on Earth. And there are independent reasons why, given relativity theory, you should think of shape as extrinsic. So when I was talking about theoretical functionalism, I just talked about folk theoretical roles. The suggestion there was that we pick out certain properties by means of folk theoretical roles that we all know about that are kind of a priori, intuitive, part of our folk physical conception of the world. When we move to second-order functionalism, things become a bit more complicated. If we suppose that spatial properties, temporal properties are individuated by relations they bear to each other, they're structurally individuated, we can't draw a line around the folk theory anymore. We have to go holistic, and we have to allow that spatiotemporal properties are actually individuated by their roles in general relativity. which is our best space-time theory. This is going to require me to say that general relativity is at least a partially conservative extension of the folk theory. That will sound controversial to anybody who knows general relativity, but I think it's plausible. Space-time is locally Euclidean. It approximates a Euclidean geometry on very small scales away from very large masses. So when we represent it as Euclidean, we don't necessarily completely misrepresent it. We represent it as it is roughly on really small scales. Now, second-order theoretical functionalism is not the only kind of second-order theory that we can give. We can also give a second-order phenomenal theory. So remember that on Dave's view, the concept of a sphere is the concept of whatever normally causes spherish experiences. When we go, so there's no constitutive connection there between the phenomenology and the reference of the concept. The concepts pick out fundamental physical stuff or matrix properties, and they pick them out by means of phenomenology. But when we go second order, if we have a second order version of functionalism, things get more complicated because now we're supposing that spatiotemporal properties could be individuated by their roles in bringing about our phenomenology. So a sphere is not whatever property happens to bring about spherish phenomenology in our world. It's the property of having some property that brings about spherish phenomenology. And that's to posit a constitutive link between the phenomenology and the properties. It's a kind of spatial idealism. Erich Schwitzgebel. Is that how you say his name? Schwitzgebel, okay. Argues for Kantian transcendental idealism on exactly this sort of basis. Yeah, so I need to speed up. So here's some varieties of functionalism. Kind of a taxonomy. You can be phenomenal functionalists about spatial concepts or properties, the first and second order versions of the theory. I think both of those theories are going to fail. The first order theory fails for the reasons I gave earlier. The second order theory, you might think it doubly fails, so it's going to fail because it still ties space and time constitutively to visual phenomenology in a way that's kind of too chauvinistic in relation to congenitally blind folk. But you might also think it fails on the grounds of idealism. Although you might not. I mean, it is something that you might think of. You know, if we're in the matrix, then is space and time somehow experientially constituted? That's something you might think. And on the second order phenomenal version of functionalism, that's exactly how it turns out. And you can be first and second order theoretical functionalists. I prefer second order theoretical functionalism, but as I say, I haven't given you an argument for that. I just want to suppose it for now and then show you that transparency follows, or at least partial transparency. Okay. So suppose spatiotemporal concepts represent space-time as structural. I think that's plausible. I think when we think of things in spatial and temporal terms, we're thinking about relations that they bear to each other. I think that's plausibly the case with spatiotemporal experiences as well. We don't experience absolute spatial properties. We experience things like relative spatial properties, relative distances being the same size as. We don't experience absolute size. We experience sameness and difference in it. Now suppose that general relativity is a partially conservative extension of that folk space-time, of that Euclidean folk space-time theory that we have. Well, if all that's true, then our common sense concepts are picking out functionally individuated properties, structural properties, in terms of the structure that individuates them. It's going to be a proper substructure. But we're picking them out in terms of the properties as the properties they actually are. So when we think about space-time, we're thinking of it in structural terms, and the properties that we're thinking about are themselves defined by their places in that structure, then we're picking them out transparently, at least partially. We're picking them out as the properties they really are. And that's only going to be true on the second-order functionalist story. You have a first-order functionalist story, you're just picking them out as the occupant of a role that they might not have occupied, an occupant of a role that doesn't define them, a role that they occupy, but it's not a defining role. As soon as we go second-order functionalist, then we can say we're picking them out as the occupants of roles that do define them. And that is to pick them out as the properties they essentially are, at least partially. And we can say the same, I think, about spatiotemporal experience. I've already suggested, I think, our experiences as of being located in space and time are plausibly structural. Well, that's a little bit more complicated, I guess, with experience. What we're doing, I think this is probably true. I don't think there's any way to represent, that we will ever be able to represent experientially a curved space-time as curved. So I mean, in general relativity, if you're not familiar with this, the space-time has an intrinsic curvature that depends on the matter distribution. And when the Earth goes around the sun, is actually following a geodesic. There's no force acting there at all. Gravitation's not a force. It looks like a force, though, and that, I think, it would be a force if we lived in a flat space-time, okay, because it wouldn't be following a straight line. So if space-time were Euclidean, we'd need a gravitational force like Newton had. But once you have a curved space-time, the force disappears, but we still experience these things as though they were not following a straight line. They're not following a geodesic as far as we experience it. We experience it as if there were a force acting on it, I think. That's a bit too much to build into the content of experience. The basic point is I think we're kind of constrained to experiencing space and time as flat Euclidean when it's not. So you might think that's a misrepresentation, and of course it is, but it approximates a Euclidean structure on very small scales away from very massive things. So we're not completely mistaken in our experience, because on this sort of scale, it's basically Euclidean. Just like if things are not moving too fast in relation to each other, we can ignore Lorentz contractions and time dilations and things like that, because they're so small as to be irrelevant. Okay. So I say, even though general and special relativity are very kind of revolutionary revisions of our ordinary conceptions of space and time, it doesn't follow that absolutely everything that we ordinarily think about space and time is false. It's approximately true if you look at the right kind of scale. So if we're representing and thinking of it as Euclidean, and it is kind of roughly Euclidean on the sort of scales that we occupy, then we're not completely mistaken. Okay. The spatial idealist view that I sketched also gives you the promise of transparency. So our concepts refer to spatiotemporal properties in terms of the ways in which they combine to give rise to phenomenology. And then we could follow Dave's view of saying that our experiences represent those very properties as the joint causes of that very phenomenology. And then you identify the phenomenology with the Frege representational content in question. But again, this is going to give us a kind of transparency, because if spatiotemporal properties themselves are second-order functional, individuated by the way in which they give rise to phenomenology, and that's how we represent them in experience and conceptually, then once again we're representing them in terms of their essential natures, as the properties that they essentially are. So once again, that's a kind of transparency. Yeah, go back to that. So how long have I got? Am I almost at the end of my... Okay, I'm almost done. Yeah. So I mean, on these kind of transparency views, on the second order views I've been sketching, what we should say about the matrix is we're representing a structure. It's a common structure. The matrix, as Dave sees it, is a complete simulation. I shouldn't call it a simulation. It's a complete implementation of our physics, of our laws of physics. And so the matrix, at a sufficiently abstract level, has the same structure as actuality. But if that's the structure that we're picking out conceptually in an experience, then what we're picking out, if we're in the matrix, is exactly the same set of properties as the ones we're picking out on the assumption that we're not. And I think this can deal with the twin cases. It can deal with the twin cases. It's anti-skeptical because our beliefs in the matrix still come out true. And you don't have to give up on transparency. So that's the kind of thing that I wanted to to persuade you of. Let me just quickly say, in conclusion, this was going to be a much bolder talk. It was going to be a talk where I argued for a form of Russellian representationalism about space-time. It was heroic. Sadly, as is so often the case in philosophy, it didn't work. So you might say, look, if second-order spatial functionalism is true, then the fact that the matrix is a phenomenal duplicate of actuality doesn't rule out Russellian representationalism. So Russellian representationalism is the view that the phenomenal character of experience is just Russellian content. It depends only on the properties represented. But if the same structural properties are instantiated in the matrix and in the actual world, then we can just identify the phenomenal character of our experiences with representations of those structural properties. So at least I thought, but it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that if we're living in a curved Riemannian space-time. According to Einstein, that's our best space-time theory. Matter distribution curves space-time. Space-time is dynamic. But we represent it as Euclidean in experience. And if we were living in a Euclidean world, presumably we'd represent that as Euclidean as well, so the phenomenology would be just the same. But the problem for Russellian representation is we can vary the curvature properties of space-time provided we keep it locally Euclidean. So we still get phenomenal twins with representational differences, and Russellian representationalism is still in as much of a mess as it is with things like colors. So that's what I was going to do. That was going to be the sexy version of this talk. So conclusions. So phenomenal functionalism, I think, is not the right story to tell about spatial concepts for the reasons I've given. But functionalism is a promising story. Theoretical functionalism is promising. That's going to enable us to say interesting things about the ontological status of space-time in quantum theories of gravity, the emergence of space-time in, for instance, string theory, loop quantum gravity. And what I've tried to persuade you of is second-order versions of these theories enable us to say all the same things, but without giving up on the intuitive transparency of space and time. So Dave is wrong to suggest that it's non-transparency that makes these anti-skeptical responses possible. Because we can make just the same kind of anti-skeptical responses if we go second-order functionalist, thereby securing partial transparency of spatial experience and conceptual representation. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Questions?
Thanks, David. That's very cool and very powerful and clear. And I think I agree with a lot of it. These are just the right distinctions to be making between the first and second order view and the phenomenal and the theoretical view. And I think, as you said at some point, those two distinctions pretty much cross-cut each other. So maybe I'll just talk about them both one at a time. I think the first order, second order issue is maybe slightly more straightforward. You said at the end that I'm wrong to say that only the non-transparency view can get the anti-skeptical consequences. I don't remember ever saying that. In any case, I certainly wouldn't say that now. Can you go find where I said it? Yeah, it's going to be really embarrassing.
I guess you didn't ever say that it's strictly necessary in order to do that. I was just interpreting this passage. Where is it? That one. I mean, it's precisely because we're directly presented with fewer features that we're less open to illusion and deception.
Yeah, I think I intended that to be consistent with the transparency view. On my view, we do have transparent access to certain features,
right, including
structural features, but we don't have transparent access to non-structural features. So even on a second order functionalist view, I think one can still say there's a sense in which you're directly presented with fewer features of the world than we might have thought. We've got the intuition that we're directly presented with, say, categorical colors, Edenic redness, or categorical features of space and time, but in fact, we don't have direct access to any such features. We do have direct access, transparent access to structural features. There's then a further issue of which one counts as space, but yeah, okay, I can see how you might have gotten that.
I guess it was the fact that it occurred specifically in the three puzzles paper that made me think that it was, you were thinking of spatial realizer functionalism as a necessary condition on the matrix anti-skeptical reply, but
I can see how you could have gotten that impression. Anyway, I've got a new paper called Structuralism as a Response to Skepticism, which is coming out soon in the Journal of Philosophy.
Cool.
And in that one, I talk very explicitly about role structuralism versus realizer structuralism. And I say both of them have equally good anti-skeptical consequences. And actually, I use that to make a few points, including that some people say, oh, this is basically the externalist response to skepticism. It's kind of externalism that's doing the work. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at it, well, the realizer version of structuralism is externalist, but the role version needn't be, especially externalism, works just as well. So I use that to say structuralism is actually what's doing the work, not externalism.
Can you send me a copy?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah. That said, I do think that the realizer view is more plausible than the role view, even though they both could do the work to defeat skepticism. And I guess this roughly comes down to intuitions about simulation versus reality for a whole bunch of stuff, including things about space. We think of simulations as having different properties in the relevant respects from non-simulations. I mean, there's one issue about what happens if we turn out to have been living in a simulation all along. Then sure, the spatial, our spatial terms will end up referring to something that makes the simulation come out as having the relevant spatial properties. But just say we're not in a simulation, and say I'm, I don't know, 10 meters away from you, and then we run a simulation of all this with simulated David and simulated Dave and so on. Do we want to say, oh, well, it's strictly speaking true that those two simulation objects are 10 meters away from each other? And I guess, I've got the intuition that no, just as, a simulated hurricane doesn't contain actual rain, it contains a simulation of rain. A simulation of space doesn't contain actual space. It contains let's say, virtual space, and those two objects are not 10 meters apart. Maybe they stand in some other relation that we could call virtual 10 meters apart. And I think those intuitions are fairly widespread. Whereas if you take the role structuralist view, it looks like all the second order properties instantiated in the non-simulated situation are instantiated in the simulated situation. So so genuine space is there, genuine spatial properties. And if we're going to apply this to all the local properties, there's a genuine, there's a genuine pentagon, and there's if it's a simulation of a galaxy inside my tiny little computer, they're going to be objects which are 4 light years apart, and it begins to look implausible.
It's not. If the simulation is that detailed, if you're literally simulating the whole universe, then I guess I don't share the resistance to saying that the space-time structure is realized there. The fact that the computer's really small, I guess, is neither here nor there, because nobody says that the space is literally located inside the computer's space. The two spaces are going to be orthogonal, in some sense of orthogonal that captures what I want to say. I don't really know what it is.
So there are objects here that really are 4 light years apart inside my little microcomputer.
Do I want to describe them as inside? They stand in relations that realize the property of being 4 light years apart. Mm-hmm. But that you can say the same thing about the matrix computer, right? The matrix computer can be a tiny little thing. If you want all your spatial beliefs to come out true in the matrix, then it's going to be true that things are 4 light years apart in that little tiny box.
Yeah, but so for us, it's not going to be a tiny box, only for people in the next universe up.
Yeah.
Whereas if we do it this way, when we're not in the matrix, then it really is a tiny box. No, there's no doubting this is, in some sense, a box which is only 2 inches across. Just that somehow, within this box which is 2 inches across. There can also be objects which are 4 light years apart.
I guess I don't find that any less plausible than the idea that there could be objects 4 light years apart within the matrix computer at the next universe up. I don't really see what the next universe up locution adds to the plausibility of the story. Why not simulate an entire universe within a computer that is already within this kind of space-time? Why couldn't you do that?
You could.
So you could simulate it, of course you could, yeah. No. But why wouldn't it be a real space-time? It's not clear to me why you'd go one way on the matrix and the other way about a simulation that's...
I mean, I think there's just, anyone can agree there's multiple properties and relations here, and there are different, same structures and different realizers, and so on. The question is kind of, and we could have spoken a language where, by space, it worked exactly your way, but then one would be committed to a certain very strong. I think language would carry with it certain tensions in situations like this, where there are multiple structures at different levels, and then it would lead to these potentially contradictory results. And the best way to resolve those contradictions is to distinguish two different levels of properties or relations here. They're 2 inches apart. They're 2 inches sub 1 apart, but they're 4 light years sub 2 apart. And once you start doing that, then I think you start moving, at least in the direction of maybe a realizer view.
Yeah, okay.
As for the phenomenal versus theoretical, I don't know, I'm happy to move on. Yeah. As for the phenomenal versus theoretical, again, I think both are available. I didn't really get a strongly clear sense of what you take to be built into the theoretical view. I mean, there's a general worry, which is, certainly there are theoretical views like Newtonian space-time that obeys all the Newtonian principles, and Einsteinian space-time, and so on. I mean, the worry is those aren't going to be terribly good for running anti-skeptical arguments, because the fact that the universe is Newtonian or Einsteinian is a very heavily empirical claim, could easily have turned out to be false. Those aren't going to be so useful for avoiding skepticism. Maybe there's a very pared down. So the question is, I'm looking for something like an a priori conceptual analysis of space-time here. Those, of course, will be a priori only relative to certain empirically known theories. Maybe there are a priori conceptual analyses of the space-time role, like, what is it? Space is what there's less interaction at. Yeah. And space is what you kind of tend to move continuously through, and so on. I didn't get a very clear sense of what you take the relevant theoretical role to be.
Well, no, I mean, that's because I don't have a relatively clear sense of what I take them to be myself. It is something I need to get clear about, and I do recognize that need. I mean, the idea I had when I wrote about this originally, there's a published a forthcoming version of this on the quantum gravity stuff, and the stuff I wrote in that is, you can write down a bunch of theoretical claims, look like theoretical claims, and they vary from relatively a priori principles to conditions on causality, and they're kind of a mixture of those two things. And then it sort of occurred to me that that's pretty much what general relativity is like, although, I mean, let me not say that there's a causal relationship between the matter distribution and the structure of space-time. Is more of a constitutive relationship or a counterfactual dependency or something like that. But it looks much the same. I mean, the metric field in GR will define areas and volumes and distances and stuff like that. So then it seemed like it might sort of be continuous with the kind of combination of a priori and causal stuff we want to say from a folk point of view. And then I just sort of muddled my way from that to, well, what if there's a second-order functionalist story where their spatiotemporal properties are individuated by their general relativistic roles, which will be some combination of relatively a priori geometric principles and causal principles, counterfactual dependencies and things like that. But no, I mean, I don't have a particularly clear sense of exactly what those roles would be. I just kind of hope there's enough continuity between common sense concepts and scientific concepts to make this partial transparency story work. But I recognize the need to get clear about exactly what the roles are.
I'd be very happy if something like that could be made to work. It'd be very nice for a number of reasons. I guess my other reason, though, for thinking phenomenology probably has to be given a role is, again, to make it, just to think about, capture how things work in cases involving variations in the relation between the world and experience, such as the ones in the 3 puzzle paper, worlds where left and right are swapped, or maybe the world where everything is twice as big, big Earth versus little Earth, and it looks like my twin is referring to, maybe they could be taken to be structurally, at least locally structurally, more or less the same, but my twin, where everything is twice as big, refers to 2 meters, where I refer to 1 meter, and then it's very naturally to think, okay, structurally, relevantly similar, what's different is the realizers of the structure, because that twin is living in a world where the relevant structures are realized by different properties. So what do you end up saying about those cases?
I originally was going to talk about those cases, but then it wasn't exactly clear to me what I should end up saying about them, so I took them out. I mean, I'm basically committed to saying that a world where everything's twice as big is just the same world as this one. I have no choice but to say that.
And even local, distant part of this universe?
Oh, I see, a local distant part of this universe. Good question. I tend to want to appeal to things like the fixity of the speed of light to get out of that. To avoid saying that they're the same properties instantiated.
It's true, it makes it harder to get these cases going perfectly, but it's also unclear that that's really getting at what's going on fundamentally with the way that
I agree.
The concepts and the reference work.
I need to give that some more thought. It was initially, I was going to talk about Thompson's case here initially, but I ended up going for your Lorentz Earth because it seemed to have, I seem to have a nicer story to tell about it than the.
I agree. There is a story you can tell about Lorentz Earth that goes transparent, but I think maybe the doubled Earth is a bit harder to handle that way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So it's you and Brian.
So, 2 things I wondered about. One, your skepticism about not being able to see geodesics seems to me to be not warranted.
Oh.
I mean, if we lived on the surface of a sphere, we might come to learn to see the shortest path between 2 points as a curve, and that would be a straight line for us, and we'd see our triangles as having the angles adding up to more than 180 degrees and so on.
Okay. That's interesting. I mean, I just hadn't thought of it. Did you think the phenomenology would change? Or would we be interpreting the phenomenology in a certain way?
Yeah, I mean, if we evolved to live on a small sphere, I don't know what our phenomenology would be like, but it doesn't seem ruled out that we might just immediately recognize that the shortest path would be walking in a straight line to walk in such a way, and 2 people that start off walking in a straight line may end up
so maybe I'm
near
a little
each other at one point and far from each other at another point.
Yeah. I'm being a little bit too Kantian about spatial experience.
The other thing I was wondering about, which in your thing about the actual world, what you're imagining the space-time structure as the geometry as emerging from. And you have to start with something like points at which properties are instantiated, some sort of topology. I mean, if you're going to write down the laws, you need to be able to have some notion of differentials and so on. So you'd need to start with something which already has some sort of a structure.
Sure. No, I agree. So I mean, in the paper where I discuss this, I kind of work on the assumption that the fundamental ontology is radically non-spatiotemporal in the sense that we can't pick out things like classical locality or anything like that, but we can certainly pick out properties and relations. I mean, there's going to be a structure of properties and relations that somehow either causally evolves into the space-time that we live in, which I think is probably the likeliest, or which realizes it synchronically. Although I'm not sure if that even makes sense. But one thing I've been trying to do is work with Laurie Paul's notion of non-spatiotemporal composition to try and figure a way that things that are not in space-time could compose things that are, by sort of composing the complex states all at once. Complex states and objects composed all at once such that the spatiotemporal properties themselves are realized And then you need a looser notion of realization where you don't actually have to posit spatiotemporal locations for the parts, but perhaps some wider sense of location within the fundamental structure.
I see. So I was thinking that that the construction should go through the fundamental laws. That seems to be the natural place to locate, so to speak, the geometry. So, I mean, Dave mentioned, or you mentioned that things that we think of as far apart have less of an effect on each other typically. And so we can sort of just take the laws, imagine them instantiated in a topology, and out of that extract a geometry from it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to give that some more thought. Maybe I'll talk to you about that later. I think I'm not quite seeing the force of the point at this stage. Let me ask you about that later.
Thanks. One thing I worry about second order functionalism when it comes to structuralism about mathematics generally is whether the mathematical objects or properties will satisfy the mathematical axioms for the theory that they're supposed to be entities for. So if you think, say, the number 1 is something like the property of being the first instant of being the first instance in some sequence that obeys the piano axioms, then you start to worry whether the numbers in the successor relation themselves satisfy the piano axioms. And I guess I have kind of a version of that worry about what you're doing. So you're going to have some axioms that are essential to your geometry, whatever they are, right? Some minimal geometrical features, maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 points determine a line, things like that. And if you think that for any system of property, the 2 points will lie in a line, or 2 objects will lie in a line, so long as there's a suitable system of relations, then I start to worry about whether you'll get the notion of line will satisfy the axioms that you want it to. So I was thinking just take a case, something like what Dave was saying. Imagine so here's the real world, and you've got a simulation. Between 2, say, bits in the simulation, there will be a real world line. There might also be a simulation line. I don't know, the simulation line might curve in an interesting way, might intersect itself. So basically, how many lines are determined by so one question is how many lines are determined. You might think one requirement is it should determine exactly one line. So how many lines are determined by those 2 points?
So you're imagining 2 points
so you've
that
got
are kind of in both systems at once? You have 2 points that are
You've got a computer,
yeah.
and they realize real lines because they're in real space. But the computer mimics real space, so they realize another, and they serve as representations of points. These points serve as representations of points in the simulated space, so they determine another line. So it seems like maybe it's the same line in 2 spaces, but I start to worry that you'll get weird results.
I wouldn't want to say that's true in the general case. So one of the things I do in the written version, which is about the problem of empirical coherence, is to make problems for these for kind of most of these versions of functionalism, actually, as applied to quantum gravity cases. Because the sense in which these fundamental ontologies are supposed to be non-spatiotemporal is just that there's no isomorphism mapping between them. So you're not going to be able to find classical locality in loop quantum gravity. You're going to find, there are various reasons why it looks difficult to identify anything like general relativistic spacetime in these fundamental ontologies. And a lot of these realization stories, by contrast, do seem to place isomorphism constraints on the functional properties in the system of realizers. I mean, that's not really going to be a problem in the matrix, because there you really do have a full-blown isomorphism. I take it it's a complete implementation of our physics. What to say about the simulation case? I still don't know what to say about that. So I don't know what to say about it in this context either. But one thing that you need to do to make this work for, well, if you want to make a realization story work for something like quantum gravity, you have to loosen up the notion of realization. You have to put some slack in between the fundamental realizers and the realized structure such that there aren't any isomorphism relations. So what you end up with, okay, is there are 2 points in the realized space which form a line in virtue of the fundamental properties and relations of their proper parts, whatever they might be, where there's no expectation that they're even composed of that there's even that there's two things in the fundamental ontology that also form a line that maps onto the one in the realized space. So I'm blathering. Look, if you want to make this stuff apply to quantum gravity situations, you have to, and you want a synchronic realization story, you need to do something like a Laurie Paul story about composition, where you can have, where mereology doesn't depend on spatiotemporal locations of the fundamental parts. And then you need a notion of realization that allows for a loose enough notion that will allow for your fundamental ontology to not have anything like the structure of the realized ontology. And it's no easy task to do that. In fact, I think the most plausible version of functionalism about space-time as applied to these cases is a kind of Paul Humphreys style of emergentism, where space-time is synchronically fundamental at this time, but it's diachronically non-fundamental because it emerged from something that wasn't spatiotemporal. So it's a diachronic story where you don't have to worry about synchronic realization anymore. How that maps onto these issues with the matrix and simulations, I don't know. I need to give it some more thought. Thank you. Did I come even close to answering your question, by the way? I'm not clear that I answered your question. Okay.
I guess that's a no.
Yeah, that's a no.
All right. The last one is going to be Rodrigo.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have a question concerning how to specify the functional roles that you need for your account. I was thinking about something that, well, seemed to me to be a rule, that we should specify the functional roles in the vocabulary that we use to refer to the properties that perform the role. It's so in the functionalism, in the mental functionalism, we specify functional roles in physical terms so that we may find which exactly physical properties perform these roles. And in a sense, I thought that in respect to phenomenal functionalism, it would be something like that. It's a phenomenal property that would perform the role that is specified in phenomenal terms, maybe others as well. But in respect to your view with the second order functionalism, it wasn't clear to me what exactly would be the vocabulary in which you would specify the functional roles, because at the end you wanted to allow properties of different kinds to perform the functional role when you think about the real world and the matrix. So I thought it's actually a question, if I understood you right, yeah, I thought maybe the functional roles would be described or characterized by means of structural properties, but then at the end there would be different kinds of properties that realize the structural properties so that they may realize the spatial temporal properties. It's something like that?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it's related to. It's a good question, and it's not one for which I have a nice, neat, and tidy, ready-made answer. It's related to Dave's point about exactly what I take the defining roles in general relativity to be. I mean, it's not like Ramsifying Newtonian mechanics where you have, theoretical terms like mass, force, and you can kind of charge and stuff like that in classical electrodynamics, and you can Ramsify against those properties. And then you leave things like acceleration unramsified, and it's all kind of straightforward to pick out the theoretical properties as the occupants of roles that are specified in terms of space-time. When you start ramsifying space-time itself, I mean, a bunch of things happen. the O language kind of disappears. So you can't have a Lewisian semantics because most of the O language disappears. I shouldn't say, it doesn't all disappear. It can't all disappear, otherwise then I have no way of specifying roles. And all sorts of things, and basically anything with the right cardinality is going to turn out as a realization of space-time, which is obviously a horrible thing, a horrible result. This is why I was hoping I could leave causation in there. I could leave causal interaction in there. Or maybe perhaps not causal interaction as we understand it in terms of transfer of energy, but causal interaction understood in terms of difference making or something like that. And then you can pick out contiguity as the property that two things need to have in order to causally interact. We just need an abstract enough notion of causal interaction that things do it in the matrix and things do it in the fundamental ontology of our world, and they're doing the same thing in those abstract terms, which is how they get to realize space-times in each case. But it's by no means straightforward, and it's a good question. How do I specify that? I don't know is the answer.
Thank you, David. And we're going to be back here in 30 minutes.
There's no way.